I heard the click before I understood what it meant. One sound, sharp and final, cutting through the empty parking garage at midnight. I looked up from my phone and saw her standing outside the window, the orange light of the garage catching the side of her face, a small brass key glinting on a thin chain against her collar. She held the master fob in her other hand. "Take me to dinner," she said, her voice calm, almost businesslike, like she was assigning a deadline. And no isn't an option. I sat there, doors locked, rain still drying on the concrete outside, and for the first time in 14 months, I didn't know what to say. My name is Nathan Bellamy. I'm 34 years old, a senior structural engineer at Kestrel Architecture Group, a firm housed in a converted ironworks warehouse in downtown Denver. I've spent the better part of a decade turning steel and concrete into buildings that stand up straight even when the ground beneath them doesn't want to cooperate. It's the kind of work that rewards patience. You learn to trust the math, to trust the process, to wait for a design to prove itself under load before you ever call it finished. I live alone now, in a rented loft 2 blocks from the Platte River, in a building with exposed brick and windows that rattle when the trains go by. 14 months ago, my divorce from Danielle Kerrigan became final. We had no children together, which people always seem surprised to hear, as if that should have made things simpler. It didn't. It just meant that when the marriage ended, there was nothing left tying us to each other except the paperwork, and even that took longer than it should have. I never talk about why the marriage ended. Not because it's some great mystery I'm protecting, but because for a long time I genuinely didn't know the real reason myself. I told people it was the usual story. 2 people who grew into different versions of themselves and stopped recognizing each other across the dinner table. That was true, as far as it went. I just didn't know yet how much further it actually went. After the divorce, I did what I imagine a lot of men my age do. I threw myself into the one thing that still made sense to me, which was work. I started staying later than I needed to, finding reasons to double-check calculations that didn't need double-checking, because an empty office at 8 in the evening felt more honest than an empty apartment. At least at the office, the silence had a purpose. That's where Warren Kestrel comes in. Warren founded the firm 31 years ago, back when Denver's skyline was half the height it is now. He's 68, built like a man who used to pour his own foundations, and he has a way of looking at a set of drawings like he's reading a letter from an old friend. Warren hired me 3 years ago, back when I was still married, back when I thought I understood the shape of my own life. The person I answer to day is Emery Radcliffe, the firm's creative director. On paper, that's all she is to me. The person who signs off on design revisions, who sits at the head of the table during client reviews, who occasionally sends a 2-line email at 11 at night that somehow manages to be both encouraging and exacting at once. We'd worked in the same building for 2 years without ever having a conversation that wasn't about a project. I knew her the way you know a colleague you respect, from a professional distance, through the shape of her decisions rather than the shape of her days. The project that had me staying late that particular Tuesday was the Meridian Tower, a 31-story mixed-use build downtown that had been eating up more of my hours than any project in recent memory. There was a cost discrepancy somewhere in the file, something Warren had mentioned in passing during a hallway conversation, nothing urgent yet, just a note that the numbers needed a second look before the next board meeting. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had no reason to. I was an engineer looking at a spreadsheet, not a man about to find out that his past marriage had left a fingerprint on his professional life that he couldn't yet see. I used to think divorce was the end of a chapter, a clean break you could point to on a calendar. What I've learned since is that it's less like closing a book and more like relearning how to eat dinner by yourself, how to fill the silence that used to belong to somebody else. I had gotten good at that silence. I didn't know yet that it was about to be interrupted, and that the interruption would start with the sound of a car door locking from the outside. Dinner that night happened at a small Italian place 2 blocks from the office, the kind of restaurant with candles stuck in old wine bottles and a menu that hadn't changed in a decade. Emery ordered for both of us without asking, which should have annoyed me and somehow didn't. We sat across from each other in a booth near the window, and for the first 20 minutes, neither of us said much beyond the logistics of the day. The Meridian file, a client call that had run long, the weather turning colder than the forecast promised. Then, somewhere between the bread and the first course, she asked me a question that had nothing to do with work. She asked what I used to want to be before I became an engineer. Nobody had asked me that in years. I told her about the summer I spent as a teenager helping my uncle frame houses outside Colorado Springs, how I'd fallen in love with the moment a structure stopped being lumber and started being a shape that could hold weight. She listened the way people rarely listen anymore, without reaching for her phone, without waiting for her turn to talk. It was easy, in a way I hadn't expected. We talked longer than either of us intended to. At one point she laughed at something I said, an unguarded sound, and I caught myself thinking I hadn't heard genuine laughter directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. The next morning, Priya Shah stopped by my desk with a stack of printouts I hadn't asked for. Priya runs operations for the firm, the kind of person who knows where every file lives and who actually reads the fine print on vendor contracts. She's sharp, quick, and has a habit of saying things sideways, as if she's testing whether you're paying attention. "You really don't remember the Hartwell meeting," she said, not quite a question. I told her I didn't know what she meant. She explained it like it was common knowledge, like I was the last person in the building to catch up. 2 years earlier, a client named Hartwell had sat across from Emery during a design review and dismissed her structural calculations outright, told her flatly that he didn't trust numbers from someone who hadn't been in the field long enough. Emery had been out that day, working remotely on a family matter, and I had been the one in the room. Apparently, I hadn't hesitated. I'd walked the client through the math myself, defended every figure on the page, and told him plainly that the numbers were sound because I had checked them twice myself. I remembered the meeting, vaguely, the way you remember doing something ordinary on an ordinary day. I hadn't thought of it since. Priya told me Emery heard about it secondhand, from her, the following week, and that something about the story had stuck with her ever since. Priya didn't say anything more than that. She just set the printouts on my desk, told me they were unrelated Meridian documents I needed to review, and walked away with the particular expression of someone who knew she'd said more than she meant to. I didn't think much of it that day, but over the following weeks, I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. The way you start seeing a certain make of car everywhere once you buy one yourself. A coffee, exactly the way I take it, waiting on my desk on mornings I'd been up too late working. A note left on a set of revised drawings, and signed, just a single line. Nice catch on the load calculations. In handwriting I couldn't place, but somehow knew wasn't Priya's. I asked Priya about it once, carefully, trying not to sound as curious as I felt. She just shrugged and said the office had good people in it. I let it go, but I started paying closer attention to Emery in meetings, to the small habit she had of reaching up and touching a thin chain at her collar whenever a client pushed back too hard, whenever a room went quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable. It looked less like a nervous gesture and more like a kind of anchor, something she held onto to remind herself she was standing on solid ground. We had dinner again the following week. Not planned, not really. I'd stayed late again, and she'd stopped by my desk on her way out and asked, almost offhand, if I'd eaten. I hadn't. We ended up at the same restaurant, and this time I asked about the necklace. "What is that open?" I said, nodding toward the small brass key resting against her collarbone. She looked down at it like she'd forgotten it was there, then smiled in a way that didn't quite reach an answer. "Someday I'll tell you," she said, and turned the conversation toward something else before I could press further. I let her. I've learned that some people give you the truth in their own time, and pushing only teaches them to hold it tighter. Over the weeks that followed, we kept finding reasons to end up in the same place at the same hour. The coffee shop on the corner where I picked up my morning order, and somehow she'd be there too. The elevator at exactly 6:15 when the rest of the building had gone quiet. None of it felt engineered. It felt like the natural drift of two people whose schedules had started overlapping on purpose without either of us saying so out loud. There was a Thursday, a few weeks into this quiet rhythm, when a client presentation went sideways. A developer we'd been courting for months questioned the load projections on a mezzanine design, not politely. I watched Emery hold the room, her voice never rising, every answer measured, and understood why Warren had trusted her with the creative direction of an entire firm before she turned 30. She wasn't just talented. She was steady in a way that made other people steady too. Afterward, in the hallway, she leaned against the wall a moment longer than she needed to, the adrenaline still working itself out of her shoulders. Neither of us said anything about the meeting. She asked instead whether I'd eaten lunch, already knowing, I suspected, that I hadn't. We split a sandwich from the shop downstairs, sitting on the low concrete wall while afternoon traffic moved past, and it struck me how easily silence sat between us now. I started noticing the pattern more clearly after that. It wasn't just coffee or the note about the load calculations. It was the way she'd mention, almost in passing, a documentary about the history of pre-stressed concrete, a subject so specific to my own work I couldn't imagine she'd landed on it by accident. It was the way she remembered, weeks later, an offhand comment about missing the mountains in autumn, and rerouted a site visit, so we drove past Clear Creek Canyon on the way back, the aspens just starting to turn. I asked Priya about it again, more directly, on a slow Friday afternoon. She just smiled the smile of someone guarding a secret that wasn't technically hers to tell. So I paid attention. I noticed the key more than anything else, the way her hand found it not just under pressure, but in quieter moments too, when a meeting ran long, when the office emptied out, and it was just the two of us left with the hum of the ventilation system and the glow of the drafting monitors. I never asked again what had opened. Some part of me understood that pushing would only teach her to keep it closer, and some part of me, the part that had spent 14 months relearning how to sit with uncertainty, had started to find a strange comfort in not knowing everything all at once. I never asked her directly why she seemed to know things about my day before I told her. I never brought up the coffee, or the note, or the strange warmth I felt every time she said my name in a meeting like it mattered more than the sentence around it. Some part of me understood, even then, that there were things Emery Radcliffe wasn't ready to say plainly, and that whatever they were, they went back further than a dinner forced by a locked car door. I didn't need her to explain it yet. I just knew that for the first time in over a year, I was looking forward to the end of the workday for a reason that had nothing to do with escaping an empty apartment. The email from Warren went out on a Monday morning, addressed to the senior staff. Subject line kept deliberately plain. Meridian Tower, cost review. He wanted a full audit of the project's expenses before the next board meeting, a routine enough request on the surface, except that Warren rarely used the word audit, unless something in the numbers had genuinely bothered him. I read the email twice and felt an unease I couldn't yet name. 10 days later, Priya found me in the break room refilling my coffee and asked if I had a minute. She led me back to her desk, where a printed spreadsheet sat waiting, one line highlighted in yellow. It was a reimbursement request, filed 2 years earlier, tied to my employee login, for an amount that had nothing to do with any project I remembered working on that week. The timestamp doesn't match your schedule, Priya said, tapping the page. You were on site at the Larimer job that whole week. I pulled the check and logs myself. I stared at the number, at my own name attached to a transaction I had no memory of making. It wasn't a large sum, not the kind that would sink a company, but it was strange in a way that made my stomach tighten. Someone had used my credentials. I didn't know who, and I didn't know why, and Priya, to her credit, didn't push me for an explanation I didn't have. She just told me she'd flag it for the audit and keep digging quietly, and asked me not to mention it to anyone else until she had more. For the rest of that week, I found myself replaying every project I'd touched 2 years earlier, trying to find some memory that explained the entry Priya had shown me. Nothing surfaced. I remembered the Larimer job clearly, remembered the cold mornings on that particular site, remembered signing in with the site supervisor because the badge reader had been malfunctioning that whole stretch of weeks. What I didn't remember was ever filing a reimbursement request for anything close to the number on that spreadsheet. The gap between what I knew to be true and what the paperwork claimed sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't put down. I didn't have to wait long for the rest of the picture to start forming, though it came from a direction I hadn't expected. Danielle resurfaced 2 weeks later, not in person at first, but in an industry newsletter that landed in half the firm's inboxes. She'd taken a position as a risk consultant for Kavanaugh Whitmore, a rival firm currently bidding against Kestrel for a major mixed-use contract downtown, the kind of deal that could define a company's next 5 years. In the article, without naming Kestrel directly, she referenced integrity concerns at unnamed firms in the current bidding pool, the kind of vague, pointed language designed to plant a seed without ever having to prove it grew from anything real. I hadn't spoken to Danielle since the divorce was finalized. Seeing her name again, attached to language clearly aimed at my company, felt like watching a door I'd closed years ago swing back open on its own. I remembered her, back when we were still married, As someone who was good at reading a room, good at knowing exactly which sentence would land hardest without ever quite crossing the line into something you could call out directly, that skill hadn't disappeared. If anything, 2 years and a new job title had sharpened it. Warren called a short meeting that same week. Not an accusation, just a quiet acknowledgement that the timing of Danielle's comments, so close to our own internal audit, was unlikely to be a coincidence. He didn't ask me to explain anything. He simply said that the firm would let the facts speak once they were fully gathered, and that in the meantime, everyone needed to keep doing their jobs as if nothing had changed. I appreciated him for that, for refusing to let a rumor dictate how he treated the people who worked for him. Still, I noticed the way certain conversations went quiet when I walked into a room that week. The way a couple of junior staff members seemed suddenly very interested in their laptops whenever I passed their desks. The gala came a week after that, a fundraiser for the Denver Architecture Foundation that half the industry attended every year, the kind of event where deals got made over past appetizers and everyone smiled a little too widely. I hadn't planned to go, but Warren insisted senior staff show up, and Emery was there too, standing near the far end of the room in conversation with a city council member when I first spotted her across the crowd. I didn't see the moment Danielle approached her. I only saw the aftermath. Emery's posture gone rigid, her hand rising briefly to the chain at her collar before dropping back to her side, her expression schooled into something carefully neutral. By the time I crossed the room, Danielle was already walking away, a glass of wine in hand, not bothering to look back. What did she want? I asked, though something in my gut already suspected the answer wasn't going to be simple. Emery hesitated before she spoke, which wasn't like her. She implied she knows things, she said finally. About the coffee. About the note. She's suggesting I've been showing favoritism toward you since your divorce, and that it's the real reason you've kept moving up on projects. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I believed there was any truth to the accusation, but because I understood, watching Emery's face, exactly how much damage a suggestion like that could do to a woman who had spent years earning her seat at that table on merit alone. A rumor like that wouldn't just threaten her reputation. It would hand ammunition to a board that already leaned skeptical of a creative director who'd risen fast and young. She's wrong, I said, quieter than the noise of the room around us. I know she's wrong, Emery said. That's not the part that worries me. She didn't explain what she meant by that. Not there, not with people close enough to overhear. But something in the way she said it told me the audit, the rumor, and whatever history sat behind that small brass key were all pulling toward the same place, and that whatever Emery had been protecting for 2 years was about to be dragged into the light, whether either of us was ready for it or not. I drove her home that night, both of us quiet for most of the ride, the city lights sliding past the windshield in long amber streaks. Before she got out of the car, she told me 2 of the board members had already asked Warren, off the record, whether her recent decisions on my project assignments deserved a second look. Nothing formal yet, just the kind of quiet question that could grow teeth if nobody addressed it directly. I sat there in the driveway long after she'd gone inside, thinking about how one woman, working from 2 states away in a job that had nothing to do with our firm anymore, had managed to put both of our reputations on the same unstable ground in the span of a single evening. I thought about the version of Danielle I married, and the version standing across a gala ballroom, throwing out half-truths like they cost her nothing, and I realized I no longer recognized any thread connecting the two. I looked for her for almost 20 minutes before I found her, working my way through a ballroom full of people who all seemed to want a piece of conversation I didn't have room for that night. I checked the courtyard first, then the hallway near the coat check, before a caterer pointed me toward the service entrance in the back. I found her on the loading dock behind the gala hall, away from the noise, her coat pulled tight against the cold, the string lights from the courtyard just barely reaching that far. She didn't seem surprised to see me. I think some part of her had been waiting. "You want to tell me what's actually going on?" I said. Not a demand, just an offer, if she wanted to take it. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. Then she reached up and wrapped her fingers around the small brass key at her collar, the way I'd seen her do a dozen times without ever asking why. "This isn't about a policy," she said. "It's not about the audit, or Danielle, or the board." She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd found her. "The night I locked your car doors, it wasn't an order. I'd been watching you pull further and further into yourself for months, staying later every week, avoiding every conversation that wasn't strictly business. I could see you disappearing, Nathan. And with everything that was starting to surface about Meridian, I was afraid that if I didn't force one honest conversation, you'd disappear completely before I ever got the chance to have it. I didn't say anything right away. The wind moved between us, cold enough that I could see her breath. I didn't lock the car door because I wanted power over you, she said. I locked it because I didn't want you to leave before I told you the truth. That I've thought about you since long before that dinner. Since a meeting I wasn't even in the room for, when you stood up for work that wasn't yours to defend, because it was the right thing to do. I've spent 2 years telling myself that saying anything would be inappropriate, unprofessional, a line I had no business crossing. And then I watched you start pulling away, and I realized I'd rather cross the line than lose the chance to tell you at all. Something in my chest loosened, the way tension does after you've been holding a beam in place for hours and finally feel the load settle correctly. I thought about the coffee, the note, the dinners that kept happening in a way that never quite felt like coincidence. I thought about the documentary on pre-stressed concrete, the drive past Clear Creek Canyon in October, 2 years of small, quiet gestures that I'd noticed but never fully understood, and how obvious they suddenly seemed now that she'd said the truth out loud. I should have said something a long time ago, she went on, her voice steadier now that the hardest part was out. But there was always a reason not to. You were married when I first noticed anything, and by the time you weren't, I told myself enough time hadn't passed, that saying anything too soon would make it about me instead of about you finding your footing again. And then I watched you get quieter every week, and I ran out of reasons to wait. I thought about how much courage it must have taken to lock a car door instead of simply letting another year pass in silence. And I found myself grateful, in a way I hadn't expected to feel that night, that she hadn't waited any longer than she did. Standing there in the cold, I understood that the boldest thing she'd ever done at work wasn't a design decision at all. It was refusing to let me drive away without knowing the truth. I have a decision to make too, I said. The audit. Whatever Danielle's trying to start. I could pull back right now, let this settle on its own, keep my name as far from the noise as possible. Or I could stay in it, help find out what actually happened with that reimbursement. Stay close to you while the board figures out what to believe. You should know staying won't be simple, she said. If the board finds out how I feel about you before this audit is settled, it could look exactly like what Danielle is already accusing me of. It could cost me more than a rumor. It could cost me the firm. Then we settle the audit first, I said. Properly. With facts, not with silence. I'd rather spend the next month proving the truth than spend it pretending I don't know how I feel about you. That's not really a question for me to answer, she said. No, I said, but I wanted you to hear me say it out loud anyway. I looked at her, at the key resting against her collar, at a woman who had spent 2 years protecting a feeling she never expected to speak, and I made the only decision that felt honest. I'm staying. Not because of you. Because of both of us. Because I'm tired of choosing silence. She didn't say anything else. She just reached out and took my hand, there on the cold concrete of the loading dock, the string lights still glowing faintly behind her. And for the first time since the divorce, I felt like I was standing on ground that wasn't going to shift underneath me. We stood there a long while before either of us mentioned going back inside, neither of us in any hurry to trade the quiet for the noise of the ballroom again. The following morning, I found Priya before she found me. I told her everything, or at least everything I understood at that point, and asked if she'd help me trace the reimbursement back to its actual source instead of letting it sit as an unexplained mark against my name. She didn't hesitate. Priya had spent a decade keeping the firm's records clean, and the idea of an unresolved discrepancy clearly bothered her more than she'd let on. It took us the better part of 4 weeks. Priya pulled login records going back 3 years, cross-referenced against building access logs, project check-in sheets, even old Wi-Fi authentication records from the router at the house I used to share with Danielle. The picture that emerged wasn't complicated once we had the pieces laid out side by side. The reimbursement request had been filed from an IP address tied to our old home network, on a date when I was verifiably on site at the Larimer project, my badge scanned in and out at hours that made it physically impossible for me to have filed anything from a desk. Someone else had used my saved login on our shared laptop, back when Danielle and I still lived under the same roof, back before either of us knew the marriage was ending. Priya compiled it all into a single report and brought it to Warren herself. I sat in on the meeting, mostly silent, watching a man who'd spent 31 years building a company weigh evidence with the same careful patience he gave to a set of structural drawings. He asked exactly the right questions. He didn't rush to any conclusion until every log had been checked twice. At one point, he set the pages down, looked at me directly, and asked whether I'd known about the reimbursement at the time it was filed. I told him the truth, that I hadn't known until the moment Priya showed me the spreadsheet, and something in his expression settled, like a man confirming a suspicion he hadn't wanted to say out loud until he was certain. Emery wasn't in that meeting. Warren had kept her deliberately separate from the review process, a decision I understood even before he explained it, given everything Danielle had tried to insinuate at the gala. It mattered that the evidence stood on its own, without either of us anywhere near the room where it got weighed. The board meeting happened the following week. Warren presented the findings plainly, without theatrics, laying the access logs and check-in records side by side, so the timeline spoke for itself, minute by minute, until even the most skeptical board member had nothing left to question. There was no vote needed, no dramatic reversal. The numbers simply told the truth once somebody bothered to look at them properly, the way good structural math always eventually does. My name was cleared from the audit entirely. 2 days later, word reached us through an industry contact that Kavanaugh Whitmore had quietly ended their consulting arrangement with Danielle, after their own compliance team apparently reviewed the same evidence and didn't like what it implied about her judgment. I didn't feel triumphant when it was over. Mostly, I felt tired, the particular exhaustion that comes after carrying a weight you didn't know you were carrying until someone finally sets it down for you. Emery and I didn't rush anything after that. For the next 6 weeks, we kept things quiet, deliberately so. She was still my creative director, still the person who signed off on my project files, and neither of us wanted the shape of what was growing between us to get tangled up in questions about favoritism, especially after everything Danielle had tried to plant. We had dinner most weeks, sometimes at the same small Italian place, sometimes at my apartment, where I cooked badly and she pretended not to notice, sitting on my counter while I burned garlic and told her stories about the summer I spent framing houses outside Colorado Springs. We took things slowly, the way you frame a building, one load-bearing decision at a time, checking that each one could hold weight before adding the next. Some weekends we drove out past Clear Creek Canyon again. No work reason attached to it this time. Just the two of us and the aspens going gold along the ridgeline. 10 weeks after the gala, the board confirmed Emery as managing partner, the youngest in the firm's history to hold the title, a decision built entirely on the strength of her portfolio and nothing else. The night it was announced, we finally stopped being careful about where people saw us together. Nobody in the office seemed surprised. Priya, I later learned, had a small betting pool going with 2 other coordinators about how long it would take us to admit what half the firm already suspected. A year passed the way years do when you're paying attention to someone instead of just enduring the days, when the seasons mean something again because you're watching them change alongside a person you love instead of just watching them pass. Warren announced his retirement that spring, choosing, without much ceremony, to hand the firm to Emery outright. On his last afternoon in the building, he walked her through the old archive room in the back of the ironworks, the space where the firm's original blueprints from 3 decades ago were still stored, mostly untouched, smelling of dust and old paper. It had always been locked. Emery had held the only key since she was 12 years old, a gift from Warren after her father, his old business partner, had passed away, back before the company even had her name attached to it in any official way. That afternoon, after Warren left, Emery found me in my office and set a small brass key on my desk, identical to the one she'd worn against her collar for as long as I'd known her. "A year ago you locked me out of my own car," I said, turning the key over in my palm, feeling its weight, small and solid and real. "Today I'm giving you a way in," she said, her voice steady, certain, nothing like the businesslike tone from that first night in the garage, and yet somehow carrying the same unshakable resolve. We walked back to the archive room together, and she let me turn the key in the old lock myself. The room, once a private inheritance nobody else was allowed to enter, was already being converted into a shared design studio. Our design studio, drafting tables set up beneath the same tall industrial windows her father had once worked under. Afternoon light came through in long amber bars, catching the dust in the air, and for a moment I just stood there, holding a key that had taken two people over 2 years, a broken marriage, a false accusation, and one locked car door to finally arrive at. I think back sometimes to that night in the parking garage, to the sound of the door locking, to how certain I was in that moment that I understood exactly what was happening and how wrong I turned out to be. I thought I was being cornered. I was actually being offered the one honest conversation I'd been too guarded to ask for myself. Emery didn't lock me in that night. She held on just long enough for me to realize I didn't want to leave. I carry that key with me now, the twin to the one she's worn since she was 12 years old, and every time I feel it in my pocket, I think about how close I came to driving home that night without ever knowing what was waiting on the other side of the glass. I think about the audit, the rumors, the woman who tried to weaponize a lie that wasn't even hers to tell, and how none of it mattered in the end nearly as much as one honest sentence spoken outside a locked car door. It would have been easy to walk away from all of it. The accusation, the uncertainty, a relationship that started under circumstances neither of us had planned. I stayed instead, and I've never once regretted the choice. So I'll ask you the same question I've had to sit with myself. Do you believe that sometimes a small act that looks like force is really just someone's most honest way of saying they're afraid to let you go? And if you're honest with yourself, is there a door in your own life that got locked a long time ago, one you've been telling yourself you're not ready to open, when the truth is you've been ready for longer than you think? If this story found something in you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments about the moment in your own life when you finally understood you were ready to stay.